Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Texas. I'm thrilled to be here to welcome you this morning to our really important discussion. And I am a newcomer myself. I just began my role here as, hey, Sarah, as president of this center and the foundation here about a month ago. And I'm really thrilled to be leading this organization in this incredible time. We don't have to go too far to see the effects of our government situation to understand that the library is closed, so I'm sorry you'll not be able to see that as well, but we are the landlord of the museum and archives and enjoy a really terrific relationship with them. We also work on matters of policy that are really organized around our guiding principle of freedom. My goal over the next 5 years or so is to make sure our areas of engagement create really interesting, reasoned, serious, compelling, thoughtful programming guided by our mission and values around freedom. Freedom from disease in our global health work, freedom from oppression in our democracy work, freedom from poverty, and from illiteracy, of course, in our work on education. I'd like to thank Provost Paul Ludden for being with us today and for participating in our discussion and for his very warm welcome to Dallas. One aspect of leading the Presidential Center here is that I'm excited about the incredible relationship that we have with Southern Methodist University. It's also fun as a former Secretary of Education to have my next professional home on a university campus. They are a terrific institution and wonderful partners with us. Being here at SMU for this discussion is relevant in that it has its own roots as a faith-based school. SMU was founded by what is now the United Methodist Church in partnership with civic leaders and was shaped by the entrepreneurial spirit of this region. And for those of you who are visitors to Texas, I hope you feel that even as you're just in our town for a few days. Even though this university is now considered non-sectarian in its teachings, the traditions of faith are still seen in SMU's student code of conduct, courses, traditions, and distinguished libraries and facilities. I'd also like to thank Mayor Rawlings for his support of faith-based schools and working with us to host this event. Mayor, you were really the catalyst for this, and so thank you for this brilliant idea. It's great to see my former administration colleague, fellow Texan, and trustee to Notre Dame, Sarah Martinez-Tucker, and her husband, Greg, with her as well. Welcome. Sarah has led on higher education issues for a very long time, and she is a terrific asset to Notre Dame and to higher education in America. I also want to thank and acknowledge the Alliance for Catholic Education at the University of Notre Dame, including Father Tim Scully, John Schoenig, and their colleagues for collaborating with us to discuss these issues. I had the privilege of speaking at an ACE graduation ceremony in 2006, and I'm glad to get an update on the program. 20 years ago, ACE started with a single program now called ACE Service Through Teaching, sort of like a Catholic version of Teach for America. Since that time, they've placed thousands of graduates from elite universities in challenged Catholic schools across the country. And over time, 70% of these people are still in education. Today, there are a dozen different initiatives at ACE, and they have become the premier producer of talent in U.S. Catholic schools. Christian Dalavis will talk about the Notre Dame ACE Academies later this morning in our panels, and it'll be wonderful to hear from her. To celebrate their 20 years of achievement, the Alliance for Catholic Education is kicking off a multi-city tour right here in Dallas, and I'm glad that we could be part of that effort as well. Now, diving deeper in today's discussion, when I was Secretary of Education, we began a conversation on this issue, and I'm proud that we're still involved with it. In September of 2008, President Bush hosted a conference discussing the need to preserve this critical national asset, our faith-based schools. At that time, the faith-based education sector had lost nearly 1,200 schools in less than 6 years. Amazing when you think about that, serving more than 400,000 students. Happily, the decline seems to have somewhat stabilized in the last few years, but when compared to 2000, there are still fewer faith-based schools today. You have to disaggregate the data, which you know I love to do, to really see a movement happening that we're here to talk about today. When you examine the data, it's a movement away from traditional faith-based schools affiliated with particular denominations, and most importantly, fewer faith-based schools in urban areas, just where they are so sorely needed. Students in our urban centers are in trouble. We know that much progress in education has been made over the last decade, even in our cities, and I like to think it's in no small part to the policies of No Child Left Behind, an era of accountability that caused our schools to focus much more intently on poor and minority students. If you compare results from our National Education Report Card for 9 and 13-year-olds in math and reading from 1999, when this era of accountability sort of began, to now, the progress has been significant. Scores for all student groups are at all-time highs. The learning gaps between minority and white students, which seemed frozen for decades, are now closing. While gains for minority students have been notable, a grade level or more of improvement, some have been incredible, like African American 9-year-olds up 20 points in reading, and Hispanic 9-year-olds up 21 points in math. That is not an accident. That is because our educators are paying more attention to our neediest students. And some urban areas have seen progress in reducing achievement gaps since 2002, but unfortunately, most of our large cities have stagnated since '09. Students in urban areas are in trouble, which means our country is in trouble. We worry about these students because of our global competitiveness, but also because the vitality of our country is dependent on them, not to mention the human consequences of our inabilities to serve them adequately. We cannot have thriving cities without thriving schools, and that requires a vibrant, faith-based school community. Mayor Rawlings and smart mayors around the country know that. Just last year, a professor at California State University published an interesting study that examined the results of 90 different research studies comparing faith-based schools to traditional and charter schools. He found that these faith-based schools produce students that have relatively strong academic and behavioral outcomes, particularly when compared to traditional public schools. Outcomes favored faith-based schools and academic measures like taking harder courses and shrinking the achievement gap, and they also, and importantly, had a strong advantage in behavioral outcomes like cooperating with teachers or not using drugs or alcohol. To put a finer point on it, the achievement gap between students of different racial or social backgrounds is significantly smaller in Catholic schools than in public schools. Children who come to Catholic school academically behind ultimately make up that achievement gap by being in Catholic schools. Additional research published by 2 professors at Notre Dame, one of whom is with us today, Professor Nicole Garnett, examined the effect of Catholic schools on a community. It turns out that not only do students suffer when a school closes, but so does the neighborhood. Duh, right? Catholic school closings are related to less socially cohesive and more disorderly neighborhoods. Some of us have had the chance to see and feel that in our own urban centers. I have some personal knowledge of what these schools mean to a community, notably Chicago. In the mid-2000s, Catholic schools were facing a financial crisis and more than 20 schools were slated for closure. As the implications of these closures became real, I remember a discussion, and interestingly, President Bush was visiting Chicago, and he and Mayor Daley were riding to an event together, and I happened to be the staffer in the car. And I remember a personal conversation between Mayor Daley, obviously a Democrat, and President Bush, talking about the need to retain and support and treasure these faith-based schools. In the immediate moment, a few schools in Chicago then were saved through generous grants and donations, through the attention that Mayor Daley gave them, and now enrollment among those schools is beginning to increase again and change. Where historically these schools educated parishioners, They are now educating more low-income and Latino non-Catholic students. There's a trend among education reformers to be champions of traditional public or public charter schools and be indifferent about our faith-based schools. This approach is wrong and puts faith-based schools at risk, and we must work together to change that. From the research, we know they deliver results, typically at a lower cost, and these schools not only focus on the academic aspects of schooling, but on personal goodness. We cannot ignore this important and successful school simply because they happen to promote faith. Faith-based schools work in our tough urban areas, and you'll hear about some success stories later today. In two broad senses, the modern education reform movement, in a policy sense, has become about choice and accountability and standards. I'd throw standards in there as part of the accountability frame. There are more options today, many more, than there were 2 decades ago. Charter schools, magnet schools, virtual schools, homeschooling, blended schools, and yes, importantly, faith-based schools. And I'm proud to say all of these schools are more focused on results, higher expectations for poor and minority students. But in the midst of this conversation, to ensure parents have better options and that these are excellent options, there's been an erosion of faith-based schools that formed the basis and the foundation of our American school system. So with that as a backdrop, you'll hear from Father Tim Scully and Professor Charles Glenn about the state of faith-based schools today and why they can and should be an important part of our overall community response to education reform. After that, you'll hear a panel of success stories. Rena Peterson will lead a discussion with some leaders in a variety of settings about what they're doing and how well they're accomplishing the goal of educating all children. And I know you will find their discussion and their work inspiring. Then, rounding us out, I'll lead a discussion with policymakers about these schools. Now, I'm happy to welcome Provost Paul Ludden to moderate our first session. Paul is SMU's Provost and Vice President for Academic Affairs. As the university's Chief Academic Officer, he oversees all aspects of academic life, ranging from admissions and faculty development to supervision of SMU's 7 schools, library system, international programs, and the university's 2 off-campus sites in Taos and Plano. Formerly Dean of the College of Natural Resources at the University of California, Berkeley, Dr. Ludden is a scholar in environmental biochemistry and holds a tenured professorship in SMU's Department of Biological Sciences. Ludden received his BS degree in chemistry from the University of Nebraska. I won't say the year, even though it's written here, and Paul, you can thank me later. And his PhD in biochemistry from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. An expert in microbial biochemistry, Ludden has published more than 175 peer-reviewed papers and book chapters. The NIH has recognized his accomplishments with the 10-year Merit Award. He's also, on a personal note, becoming a very good friend and wonderful colleague as we work together to bring good ideas, good thinking, and important scholarship here to SMU and to the Bush Center. So without further ado, Paul Ludden.